Hello, and thank you for joining the College of American Pathologists webinar, Preparing for Implementation of the FDA's Laboratory Developed Tests Final Rule. I'm Charles Fiegel, Director for the CAP's Advocacy Communications. A couple of quick logistics before we get started. We will be taking questions at the end of the presentation of today's meeting. Click the Q&A icon on your Zoom control panel and type your questions. We'll do our best to get to as many as possible at the end of today's session. It is now my pleasure to introduce to you the president of the CAP, Dr. Donald Karcher.
Thanks very much, Charles, and hello and welcome everyone to today's webinar. I'm Don Karcher, I'm president of the CAP, and we're here today to give you an update, as Charles mentioned, on the recently released FDA final rule on oversight of LDTs. Next slide, please. So here's our agenda for today's webinar. I'll be introducing our other two panelists in a moment, and then we'll give some background and an overview of the final rule. We'll also talk a bit about the FDA's response after release of the final rule. Then we'll give an update on how Congress is reacting to the rule. And then finally, we will get to as many of your questions as we can. And we're going to answer those questions as best we can based on what we know at this time. We are still studying this final rule. It's 528 pages long. And we have not yet had an opportunity to meet with FDA leaders, which we are expecting to do in the very near future. Next slide, please. So I'm very pleased to be joined today by Dr. Bobby Pritt, who is the current chair of the CAP Council on Scientific Affairs, and Dr. Joe Saad, chair of the CAP Council on Government and Professional Affairs. Next slide, please. So let's get started with a little background, just to put all of this into perspective. As I think you all know, the proposed oversight of LDTs by the FDA has been an active issue for more than 10 years. In fact, it's really been around quite a bit longer than that. The FDA believes that it has had regulatory jurisdiction over LDTs since 1976, and that's based on the Medical Device Amendments of 1976, which amended the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act. Although they've had this authority, they've exercised what they call enforcement discretion, which means that they have not exercised their regulatory authority. Because of the increasing complexity of LDTs over the years and the dramatic increase in their use, in 2010, the FDA announced their intention to regulate these tests. The FDA in 2014 released a draft guidance document. That document led to a great deal of debate, but a final guidance document was actually never released based on that original draft. In 2017, it was made clear both by Congress and the White House that a legislative solution should really be sought for this. And multiple legislative proposals followed. However, none were successful. In 2018, a new regulatory framework was proposed, and this eventually became the VALID Act. Over 4 years, the VALID Act was debated and revised, and in 2022, it was close to being taken up by Congress, but it never made it to the Senate or House floor for a final vote. Throughout this entire period, the CAP's consistent goal has been for any LDT oversight to result in 3 things. First, great quality for patients. Next, continued development and patient access to innovative LDTs. And then finally, minimal burden and cost for laboratories. In the end, the CAP did support the VALID Act because we viewed it as a balanced approach that achieved these 3 goals, and perhaps more importantly, it placed significant guardrails around what the FDA could and couldn't do in regulating LDTs. So when the VALID Act did not pass in 2022, the FDA made it very clear that they were prepared to regulate LDTs under their existing statutory authority, under that amendment, the Amendment Act that I mentioned earlier from 1976. They were true to their word. So in October of last year, they released a proposed rule for oversight of LDTs, and then the final rule was released on April 29th. Next slide, please. So the CAP, I think you probably all know, vigorously opposed the FDA proposed rule, and we sought significant changes in this rule. The various things that we did, we provided detailed written comments, as did 6,700 other commentators to the proposed rule. We submitted those on December 4th. We also gave congressional testimony. I testified before the E&C Health Subcommittee in March. And we also met with FDA. We met with members of Congress and with the White House. In the final rule, the FDA did make several changes, including some that we advocated for. Next slide, please. So I'd like to give some of the highlights of the final rule. Once again, it's a very large and very complex document, 528 pages long. I'm going to hit the highlights as best I can. Next slide, please. So, as I noted, the FDA did make several changes, including some that the the CAP advocated for. But we're still concerned with the final rule, and we're worried about the burden that it places on laboratories and on pathologists, and potentially on the deprivation of innovative LDTs for patients. So the basic provisions of the rule is that it employs a three-tiered risk-based structure. This has been proposed literally for more than a decade. The number of tiers varied a bit during this whole period of long debate, but ultimately the final rule includes what we believe is the best approach, which is that it is a three-tiered approach, and it's based on risk to patients. This is a separate issue from complexity as defined by CLIA. This is basically what risk a test result may place on a patient. So the rule, the general provisions of the rule is that it phases out that general enforcement discretion that I mentioned that they've been exercising since 1976 in 5 stages, and those stages will be completed by May of 2028. Next slide, please. So we advocated for a very long list of changes in the proposed rule. The FDA did respond positively to 2 of our requests, and frankly, many other stakeholders requested similar changes. First of all, LDTs that were developed prior to the regulations issuance, which was in early May, will remain under enforcement discretion. Now, that doesn't mean that there's no regulatory oversight of those. We'll talk a little bit about what things will still be necessary for those tests, but they did grant a so-called grandfather clause for LDTs that we are currently using in our laboratories. Another one, and this was one that we feel is potentially a positive provision. This is something that we pushed hard for because we felt that a laboratory that's hospital-based or embedded in a healthcare system, and when we're producing and performing LDTs for patients in our hospital or healthcare system, this represents a significant mitigating factor that allows those LDTs to be safely used because we are in constant communication with the physicians and other healthcare providers that would be ordering these tests, and we are following very often those same patients. So this provision allows enforcement discretion to continue for LDTs developed and performed by a laboratory that's integrated within a healthcare system, in a hospital or a healthcare system, to meet an unmet clinical need. Now, the patients that this applies to must be receiving care within the same system, and there must be no equivalent FDA-authorized test available to the patient. Now, let me clarify a little bit on that point. If an FDA-authorized test exists, but because of circumstances may not be available to a patient in that hospital or health system, then the laboratory that serves that system can still develop an LDT for that clinical need. And there are circumstances where an FDA-approved test or authorized test may not be able to be performed, and that allows us to continue to develop LDTs. Now, this was a little narrower than what we wanted. We really didn't want that final bullet to be part of this, but we feel that actually this is why we think many and arguably most LDTs that are developed by hospital-based and system-based labs, which is most laboratories in the US, this is the reason why LDTs are developed. And we believe that this offers some opportunities to be relieved of full FDA oversight for these tests. Now, there is still some oversight that will apply, and we'll detail that in just a few moments. Now, I must tell you that within the final rule, there are about 10 pages of caveats that deal with this enforcement discretion for clinically unmet needs. We are currently working our way literally line by line through those caveats, and we will be getting more clarification on this when we meet with FDA leaders in the near future. But on balance, we regard this as a rather positive response from the FDA. And once again, this was not only advocated for by the CAP, but many other stakeholders. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that this will result in a staged disappearance of enforcement discretion. The first three stages actually deal mostly with reporting, with correction and reporting, with system requirements for complaints, registration, labeling, a lot of the details of producing tests. And these three stages, definitely stages 1 and 2, and at least parts of stage 3, will apply even to the grandfathered LDTs that I mentioned. However, those grandfathered LDTs will be exempted from stages 4 and 5. And as you can see, stage 4 will deal with pre-market review for high-risk LDTs, and stage 5, ultimately the final stage in May of 2028, pre-market review of moderate and low-risk LDTs. Now, I need to mention when we're talking about risk that we feel, and I think we have a lot of support for this, that the truly high-risk LDTs are a relatively small sliver of the LDTs that are produced and run for patients. And we will continue to advocate for that definition of high risk and for that category of tests to be as narrow and as small as possible. Next slide, please. So just to clarify, there are certain tests that are not subject to the phase-out policy, and the first three of these were never subject to enforcement discretion, so they will continue to not have enforcement discretion. This would be tests for blood donor screening or human cell tissue or tissue-based product donor screening, tests for public health emergencies, and direct-to-consumer tests. These have never been subject to enforcement discretion, and that will continue. Other tests that are not subject to this phase-out period, one example is tests used for public health surveillance. Those are a different category of test anyway, so they're not going to be phased out because they don't actually fall under this regulatory framework. Next slide, please. So this is one of the potentially important provisions in the final rule, that FDA enforcement discretion will continue to apply to the following tests. One, and a very important one, is what they refer to as 1976 type LDTs. LDTs that use manual techniques, and the definition is still being debated, and we will clarify that with the FDA. But as of the written definition, it should not use any automation. We think there's some room for negotiation on that point. The next component, or the next provision, is that the components have to be legally marketed for clinical use, and then it's used by a single CLIA-certified high-complexity laboratory, which applies to all LDTs, actually. The second category is certain HLA tests for transplantation, forensic tests, and also LDTs used by the Department of Defense and Veterans Health Administration. Federal agencies such as those are always exempted from rules such as this. Next slide, please. So these were the provisions and some of the changes that the FDA made in the final rule. So enforcement discretion will apply with respect to the pre-market requirements in stages 4 and 5 to currently marketed LDTs, what we are calling grandfathered LDTs. These are LDTs that were marketed and used in our laboratories prior to the issuance date of the LDT rule, which was on May 6th of this year, officially. And that they are not modified, or if they are modified, in a very limited way. Secondly, LDTs for unmet clinical needs in a local health system, as I described earlier. Next, LDTs approved by New York State Clinical Laboratory Evaluation Program, or CLEP. New York State has a system in place that many people feel provides all of the same safeties that the FDA is striving for in their final rule. And many laboratories, not only in New York State, but many laboratories around the country that perform tests for New York citizens fall under this category, and they are given a waiver if they have that designation. Also non-molecular anti-sera LDTs for rare RBC antigens, and also modified versions of 510K cleared or de novo authorized tests that were made by someone else and that you were only making minor changes. Those are granted enforcement discretion for stages 4 and 5. Excuse me. I need to clarify that these LDTs must still meet the reporting and complaint and quality system requirements that are included in stages 1 and 2, and at least partly the ones included in stage 3. Next slide, please. So I'd now like to ask Dr. Pritt to give us an overview of the FDA response post-rulemaking. Dr. Pritt.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Karcher. So I'm now going to discuss FDA's response post-final rulemaking. So if we can go to the next slide, please. The FDA held a webinar on May 14th where they discussed certain aspects of the final ruling. Many of those aspects were just clarified by Dr. Karcher. And during that webinar, participants were given the opportunity to ask questions. The CAP had multiple questions at that point. And I'd like to share with you 3 of the questions that we asked with the answers that we think are particularly relevant. As Dr. Karcher mentioned, there are still many points that we are seeking clarification on. And so we will continue to pursue those as well. The first question, regarding FDA policy on LDTs for unmet needs, is a health system's LDT for an unmet need impacted by a subsequent FDA authorization of an IVD for that same unmet need? The FDA did respond and they said, yes, the health system's LDT would no longer fall within the unmet need enforcement discretion policy. However, they gave a caveat that if the FDA authorized IVD was unavailable to the patient in that first health system, for example, if the authorized test was only available in a different health system and the manufacturer of that authorized test was not selling it to other labs, then the LDT for the unmet need could still be offered. Next slide, please. Question 2, for LDTs in use prior to the rule's issuance date, are they required to comply with stages 1 and 2 of the final rule? And will there be additional guidance outlining these processes, which are understandably unfamiliar for many laboratories? So they did indicate that additional guidance from the FDA will be forthcoming. And they also clarified that FDA will expect compliance with the stages 1 and 2 as outlined in their final ruling. So for example, medical device reporting in phase 1 would still need to occur even for an LDT that was issued prior to the rule's issuance date or put into place. Also, registration and device listing, labeling, and investigational requirements would still need to be occurred in phase 2. Next slide. Back one slide. Thank you. So the third question, we also asked about the 1976 type LDTs, and there's a lot of clarification that needs to be sought on this. We asked specifically whether immunohistochemistry or flow cytometry would qualify for enforcement discretion. And the FDA responded by saying that these 1976 type LDTs must use manual techniques, as Dr. Karcher was just discussing, without automation. We do think there's some room there for clarification, which we will be seeking. They have to be performed by the laboratory personnel with that specialized expertise. They have to use components legally marketed for clinical use and be designed, manufactured, and used within a single CLIA certified laboratory that meets those requirements under CLIA for high complexity testing. Next slide, please. On this slide, there's a QR code. So for those of you who are interested, I would encourage you to scan the code with your smartphone. It will bring you to the FDA LDT website. There is information on this website, including the transcript to the recent webinar. And if you scroll down on the website, you will find the chart that we are showing here on this slide. It shows the category of IVD. And then under each category, as you go across each row, you could see if stages 1 through 5 would be applicable to that particular type of IVD. So this is useful initial guidance. But if we go to the next slide, I think there's many opportunities still to get further clarification, and the FDA is going to be hosting additional webinars. We know that the first one will be on June 5th. They'll be discussing enforcement policies. They also indicated, but these are still tentative, that during the month of July, they will be discussing IVD classification. And then during the month of August, they will be having webinars on medical device reporting, quality system, complaint requirements, and recalls. So with that, I'd like to now turn this over. We can go to the next slide, and I will turn this over to my colleague, Dr. Joe Sod.
Thank you, Dr. Pritt, and good day to everyone. I'd like to switch gears a little bit and talk about the politics around LDTs. Next slide, please. So when the final rule was released on May 6th, there was an immediate response from several members of Congress. It was generally met by these members with disappointment. Many argued that the FDA does not have the authority to regulate LDTs. Others said that the FDA should abandon the rule, and some came out and said that we should resume work on the VALID Act. I just want to quote a couple of these members of Congress. First of all, Representative Kathy McMorris Rodgers from Washington State, and she actually worked against passage of the VALID Act in 2022, said that while the final rule is a slight improvement to the proposed rule, it will still increase costs and decrease access to diagnostic and medical tests that provide information crucial for doctors to treat their patients effectively. She called on the agency to abandon the rule. Senator Bill Cassidy of Louisiana stated that the FDA does not have the authority to unilaterally increase its regulatory jurisdiction. This rule will undermine access to essential laboratory tests, increase healthcare costs, and ultimately harm patients. Congress needs to take action to clarify the regulatory structure for diagnostic tests. And Representatives Larry Bucshon and DeGette, who are among VALID's most prominent supporters in the House, issued a statement that they were disappointed that the FDA moved ahead with the rule. They recognize the FDA's action is because Congress hasn't yet acted. They urge Congress and industry partners to resume work on VALID. Next slide, please. So what are the options within the potential to impact this rule? So we have the three branches of government. The White House, the executive branch, has basically signed off on this rule. We know it went to OMB, and the final rule was released after review. We have the judicial branch, which has not yet acted and will not act unless there is a legal challenge to this rule. And finally, we have the legislative branch, or Congress. What's within the congressional power? One possible mechanism is the Congressional Review Act. This was passed in 1996 under President Bill Clinton, and it allows for Congress to void rules by federal agencies. Overall, it's rarely used. To be successful, it typically must be used when there's a new president from a different party than the predecessor entering the White House, and the new president's party fully controls Congress. It has only been used rarely successfully. In the Trump administration, 16 administrative rules were repealed. However, before that, there was only one successful use of the Congressional Review Act in 2001, when President Bush reversed an ergonomic standard rule. Having said that, lawmakers opposed to the FDA rule have introduced a Congressional Review Act resolution in both the House and the Senate. In the House, it was introduced by Representatives Finstead and Crenshaw, and in the Senate by Senator Rand Paul. It is unlikely that in this administration, such a resolution will pass. Next slide, please. So as Dr. Karcher mentioned in his introductory remarks, the FDA is acting under authority of the Medical Device Amendments of 1976 to the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that classified IVDs as medical devices. Although for years they didn't address it, eventually they came and said that LDTs fall under their jurisdiction because of this amendment. The VALID Act, or the Verifying Accurate Leading Edge IVCT development, would actually create a new regulatory framework that would place in vitro clinical tests, including LDTs, under the FDA, but with a new framework. It establishes guardrails on FDA oversight authority and lowers the burdens on laboratories with exemptions and new pathways to down-classify test requirements. As mentioned, this bill was introduced by Representatives Bouchon and DeGette, and they are trying to revive it in the House. In the Senate, we don't have a companion bill. So currently, Congress continues to discuss the bill, and we believe there has been a new effort to try to revamp the bill and perhaps consider it going forward. And with that, I would like to turn it back over to Dr. Karcher, who will moderate our Q&A.
Thanks very much, Dr. Saad and Dr. Pritt, for detailing what's been going on since this rule was released. Now, it's time now to answer your questions, and I've just glanced at the 37 questions that have been submitted so far. So we're going to do our best to address as many of these questions and people seeking clarification on a lot of these provisions as we can. I do want to emphasize that we also have a long list of questions, and you could, as you well imagine, I suspect can well imagine, the FDA is very backed up right now. Everyone in the laboratory community is trying to meet with them. We are on their docket. We have not yet had an opportunity to sit down with FDA leaders, but we will be in the very near future. And I think we'll be in a better position to answer some of the questions and give clarifications once we have an opportunity to do it. We'll do our best today based on what we know today. So Charles, can you give us the first question?
Yes, Dr. Karcher. I'm a pathologist in a community hospital. Can you provide clarification on what unmet needs means?
Yes, I mean, that's a very important question. Although we gave some details on that, I mentioned that this provision in the rule has 10 pages of caveats. So we're working our way through that. The essence of this is if there is not an FDA authorized test that meets the specific clinical need of a patient, and that patient is cared for in the healthcare system where the laboratory is located, then that laboratory can develop an LDT for use for their patients cared for in that health system. As I mentioned, this is something that we pushed hard for because we believe that the fact that these tests are being run for patients in our own hospital or healthcare system allows for a much higher level of safety and much, much lower risk for the patients. Now, the definition of unmet clinical needs is complicated. I mentioned about no FDA approved or cleared test. Now, if there's an FDA or approved or cleared test that has a very long turnaround time, and if an LDT is developed that has a shorter turnaround time, that is still subject to enforcement discretion. That does not fall under the pre-market or other provisions that would be required for many of the LDTs. So that's one example. Actually glanced at one question that was asked about pediatric patients. One of our attendees, asked for clarification of a pediatric patient. That was actually specifically mentioned in the final rule, and that tests that are modified because there's no FDA approved or cleared test that's appropriate for a pediatric age patient clearly qualifies for this enforcement discretion. Or if it's for a disease that in many pediatric patients, relatively rare diseases, And many pediatric hospitals have to develop LDTs for those diseases. That clearly qualifies because there is typically no FDA approved or cleared test for that. Now, there's some other finer, provisions in caveats here. For instance, they made it very clear that just simply saving money does not qualify an LDT for this. If there's an FDA approved or cleared test, and you want to develop a test that's cheaper, that does not qualify. Actually, in glancing through the questions, which now number 70, we have 70 questions. One person was asking about what if the FDA approved test is on a platform that I don't have in my lab? Am I going to be required to purchase that platform, or can I develop an LDT that doesn't use that platform? That's one of our definitely a list of questions that we're going to pose to the FDA, because that is a very common scenario, and we want to get some clarification on that. So unfortunately today we don't have a final answer on that part of it. So those are the major provisions of this. Dr. Saad or Pritt, you want to add anything to that? Did I overlook something?
No, I think that was very comprehensive, Dr. Karcher. I just want to add to this community pathologist that's curious about an unmet need and developing an LDT. There is a statement in there that talks about an integrated health system, but also that the laboratory director needs to be employed by the health system. And that may affect some of us that are independent contractors and may not be employed. And we need further clarification on that from the FDA.
Yeah, that's actually on our list to question them, because we believe that a laboratory director that maybe is part of a pathology group that is contracted to a hospital or health system, that pathologist is employed by the group, and the group is contracted to that health system. We would regard that as fulfilling that requirement, but we have to get some clarification from the FDA. Dr. Pritt, did you want to add anything to this one?
Only that these are excellent questions, and this will help us do a better job in really honing in on the important points when we meet with the FDA shortly.
Yes, good point. Charles, what's the next question?
Is updating CLIA through legislation in Congress an option moving forward?
Yeah, well, that's a very important question, actually. And I'll start with this one, and my colleagues can hopefully add some additional details. But this has been proposed as an alternative that if we could just quote unquote fix CLIA and change it such that all LDTs could be overseen through CLIA certification of the laboratory, that would be an easier pathway. This is an approach that we have grave concerns about. CLIA, as we all know, has been in place for more than 3 decades. We believe it has, it has served us well, and it provides a framework for all clinical laboratory testing in the United States, which is very high quality. And we would worry very much that reopening it in a major way, legislatively, could lead to many, many unintended consequences. When there is legislation being debated in Congress, as you might expect, many stakeholders are advocating for things they want. And many of the things that some stakeholders want, we believe, would not be positive for laboratory testing. So we're very concerned about that possibility. Now, CLIA does get revised periodically. There is through a regulatory process. It's a bit of a slow process, but many changes have taken place in CLIA and are currently being debated as we speak. So we think there's a mechanism to keep CLIA modern and appropriate for testing, but fully reopening it legislatively could lead down some very dark alleys that we think would potentially disrupt the framework under which our clinical laboratories have operated very successfully for decades. Drs. Pritt, Saad, do you want to add anything to that?
So yes, I mean, that's a great question. I would just like to add that on top of what Dr. Karcher said, both the FDA and CLIA have on at least 2 occasions in 2013, and they reiterated earlier this year, that they both believe that the FDA is the appropriate agency to regulate LDTs. CLIA does not want that responsibility. The FDA wants it. And so it would be very hard for us to force something upon an agency that doesn't want it. So CLIA taking the lead on LDTs is a very heavy lift.
Yeah, thanks for adding that. Another little aspect of this is that, in theory, the FDA may still have a role. Even if CLIA is completely rewritten and most LDTs are regulated through CLIA, it's very likely that there's going to be a category of tests that just for one reason or another will still be regulated by the FDA. Therefore, we would have two frameworks in which to work. And that we feel is not in our best interest and certainly not in patients' best interest. So next question, Charles.
Utilizing the category of unmet need, turnaround time for appropriate patient care for your health system patients when no FDA-approved test exists for a test that was not marketed prior to May 6th of 2024, what stages must be completed? Compliance with phases 1 and 2 and phase 3 QSR design control and compliance files?
So if I understand the question correctly, this is if it fulfills the unmet clinical need requirements, and it was not already being offered to patients prior to May 6th of this year, what stages of regulation would apply to it? And I believe the answer has been provided in the question. It's basically stages 1, 2, and parts of stage 3. Dr. Pritt, you and I talked about this the other day. Can you
Right.
clarify that?
Yes, the chart that I showed earlier outlines those different types of IVDs and then what would be applicable stages 1 through 5. And I saw that there was a request as one of the questions to show that QR code again. I don't know if we could show that now or we could show it at some point. If we don't, it's also important to note that this webinar is being recorded so you can go back. I would go to that website and read carefully what has been provided so far by the FDA, and then we will continue to seek clarity. But Dr. Karcher is correct. It is stages 1 and 2 and parts of 3.
Yes, thanks, Dr. Pritt. And in fact, this is a good time to point out that, yes, this webinar is being recorded. The slides and the recording will be available so people would have an opportunity to view this again. And there is the QR code.
Perfect.
Right on cue.
Yeah.
No pun intended. Thank you. Next question, please, Charles.
Who enforces this in the real world?
That seems like a rather loaded question to me, but so, the proposed, or no, it's not proposed, it's the final rule. The enforcement is by the FDA, and the FDA feels it has the statutory authority to do this. So the FDA can demand if a test does not fulfill the list of requirements, they can demand that test, that the laboratory basically cease and desist providing that test. They actually have exercised that ability a few times since 1976 when there were particularly noteworthy poor quality LDTs. There have been a few that have been actually very well known nationally that were very problematic, and the FDA did exercise that authority, and they demanded basically that those tests be taken down, and they were. So that's the way this would be enforced in the real world. I hope I'm answering that question.
Yes, and there's a second part here.
Okay.
How will a CAP inspector know whether an LDT is grandfathered, has been properly registered, meets discretion's eligibility guidelines, et cetera?
Yeah, that is, actually, it's not part of our accreditation process. So very, we would be reviewing as we currently do the validation records for an LDT. We could certainly note the date, that LDT was offered, which should be part of that file. But as of this point in time, we would not be mandated to check to see if an LDT has been properly registered with the FDA. My colleagues, anything to add to that one?
Well, I would just add that at this point, we are not anticipating any changes to the CAP checklist for 2025. Going forward, we'll just have to wait and see. But as of yet, our inspections are going to be as they always have been.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Next question, please, Charles.
Will the CAP define the risks categories? It is not included in the document from the FDA and seems different from how CLIA defines risk categorization. Therefore, it seems premature to keep supporting high-risk tests being important to regulate when we don't know what they are.
Well, this is a key question, actually, and how tests are classified by as regarding risk is a very big question. So let me just emphasize, I said briefly, but I'll just emphasize again, patient risk and complexity are completely different things. All LDTs are high complexity. So by definition, they're all high complexity tests. That's embedded in CLIA. So the risk is a different matter. High risk means basically danger to the patient, to patient safety. And then lower risk levels, of course, would be less risk to the patient. Now, the CAP is not in a position to determine that risk categorization of tests. That is going to be the FDA. Now, the FDA did in the final rule say that they're going to use their existing advisory committee structure to receive input on risk for tests. We had advocated that they provide, more opportunities for stakeholders to weigh in on test risk and other aspects of the rule. They are going to stick with their current structure. So I can assure you that the CAP will do our best to make sure that those committees are populated with people who really understand the tests and understand the context of LDTs. It's going to be very important for them to understand that. You should also know that the FDA announced several weeks ago that they are involved in a project to quote unquote down risk currently high risk tests under their current system. They expect that will take a while, probably a few years, and may very well, I suspect, coincide with when the high risk, when stage 4 goes into effect. They're very likely targeting, down risking tests to coincide with that. That's my guess. They've never told us that, but I suspect that's part of what they're doing. Dr. Pritt, Saad, anything to add to that?
So for a new LDT, my understanding is that it's automatically high risk, a brand new LDT. And then you look for a predicate test out there to which you can tie it to possibly bring it down to a class 2 or moderate risk. Or you wait for the FDA to classify it for you. But any new LDT, I think, is automatically high risk until otherwise determined by the FDA or by a predicate test.
I would agree with what's said. And I think that in stages 1 and 2, when there is the actual reporting of the test, I'm assuming, but we don't know for sure at this point, that the FDA will weigh in at that point and may request additional information, could discuss if something meets various qualifications. Again, we don't know this yet for sure.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Dr. Saad and Dr. Pritt, for adding that. And I just want to emphasize one last time, risk is not the same as complexity, and we should not confuse those two. So, Charles, next question, please.
Is enforcement discretion given to LDTs in use before the FDA rule date of issuance, May 6th, 2024,
Yes.
or the effective date listed in the ruling, July 5th?
Our understanding is that the operative date is May 6th of 2024. We're going to, once again, seek absolute crystal clear clarification from the FDA, but our understanding is that is the operative date. So the answer is yes. Before any test before that date, enforcement discretion continues for stages 4 and 5, but they're still subject to 1, 2, and parts of 3.
And I'll just add, there were some questions in the Q&A session that asked if someone were to implement a new test tomorrow or change a method, change an instrument, presumably at that point, that is going to fall under the FDA's jurisdiction, and they're going to potentially have implications for those tests.
Yes. Now, they did say that they would allow very minor changes to tests that fell into that category. So it may not be every change to the test. It would have to be substantial changes. Next question, please.
Do you have clarification on if IHC is waived?
So this is another very important question for most of us, and this is one we're very worried about. So IHCs were actually addressed specifically in the final rule, and the FDA is basically saying that if they are performed manually, the operative word there is manually. How do you define that? Very few laboratories actually manually stain slides, IHCs, and most of us use slide stainers. And we've already begun the debate with the FDA on that point. Another important aspect of this, of course, is that we have positive and negative controls, which before we interpret an IHC, we evaluate, and we can determine very quickly that the stain did not work appropriately. And we have shared that information with the FDA. So this is one of the very important points that we're going to be addressing when we sit down with FDA leaders. As of this point in time, it seems like most of our IHCs would not qualify for this 1976 style LDT, but there is some verbiage in the final rule that we believe the FDA left a small open door for debate as to definitions, and we expect to walk through that crack in the door and engage in that debate with them. Anything to add, Drs. Pritt and Saad?
I would just add this is so important to so many of our members that we really do need to be crystal clear in the answer that we get from the FDA. Yeah. Their estimate of the number of labs it would involve would increase by 2 or 3 or 4-fold if IHC were included as being, if it's automated, then it wouldn't be excluded from the rule, at least so-called grandfathered in. The other thing is flow cytometry is very important. We have a lot of concern from our members about flow cytometry, followed by things like body fluid chemistries. So we do have a lot of questions, and we need a lot of answers from the FDA.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned flow cytometry. I am a hematopathologist, and I run the flow lab at George Washington University Medical Center. This is a big deal for me, so I take this one very personally. And of course, as you know, as a hematopathologist, I use a lot of IHCs. Next question, Charles.
The CAP has stringent standards for laboratory director approval of LDTs. For in-use LDTs, what do the stages 1, 2, and 3 mean we will have to do?
So there's a lot of detail in those 3 stages. And so we are going to be seeking clarification, in terms of answering a lot of questions in terms of exactly what has to be done. But those stages basically apply to, basically reporting that you're performing the LDT, that you fulfill the quality system components of the LDT, that you have a quality system in place for complaints and therefore reporting problems to the FDA. In terms of the specific role of the laboratory director in approving an LDT for use prior to May 6th of 2024, I would be surprised if the FDA is going to be raising questions in retrospect in terms of the role of that laboratory director that approved the use of that LDT. But that's a question that we will need to clarify. My colleagues have anything to add to that one?
Yeah, Dr. Karcher, I'll just add that even tests that fall under the discretion, the regulatory discretion of the FDA, still might have to fulfill those qualifications for steps 1, 2, or phases 1, 2, and parts of 3. And that's where we get back to that chart that I had shown earlier. It's really important to look at that, and CAP will provide guidance in the future as well.
Yes, thank you. Dr. Saad, anything else for that one? Okay, Charles, next question, please.
We have a question about the CAP's advocacy position on LDTs, and there's questions about where we are in our advocacy on LDTs. So maybe we can take a couple of minutes to discuss that.
Yeah, well, that's very important. And in my introduction, I sort of gave a bit of the history, but I will just say first of all that we've been actively engaged in this, and we've been engaged with Congress and the FDA and many other stakeholders for the better part of 12 or 14 years on this issue. And our position, our goal from day one and continues to this day is that we want to make sure that LDTs result in great patient quality and patient safety, that that any regulation allows innovation to continue and that these tests continue to be available and offered to patients. And then finally, that the burden and the cost on laboratories is minimized as much as can be. All through this period, we have held very true to those three principles. And at various times, we've looked at different approaches. And we have consistently felt that the FDA we believe, is the correct agency to oversee these tests. Understanding that there are others that may feel that maybe CMS could do this. Dr. Saad mentioned that the FDA and the CMS leaders have gone on the record as saying they both believe that the FDA is the right agency. We have felt that it's very likely true, and that has been the path that we've taken. As I mentioned, we did ultimately support the VALID Act, but we did not support it literally until the last moment, right before it was presented to the Senate Help Committee. We worked for 4 years with members of Congress and with advice and with interaction, I should say, with the FDA to make the VALID Act as good as it could be. And we felt at the very end of the process, we felt that it fulfilled the three goals that we've held. And it also provided, and I want to emphasize this, it provided guardrails around what the FDA could and more importantly could not do in terms of their regulation. They are currently regulating with no guardrails. And that's what worries us. And we felt that the proposed rule, and frankly, the final rule, has a lot in it that we feel is still needs guardrails. So our position right now is, there's a lot that we still do not like about the final rule. We are closely watching events in Congress because we did support the VALID Act in 2022 when it didn't pass. We are still hopeful that maybe it could be resurrected. We still believe that it is a balanced approach that represents a compromise and once again provides, we think, very important guardrails around what the FDA cannot do in terms of regulating these tests. So that's where we are right now. Dr. Saad, this might be a question in your area.
You covered it very well, Dr. Karcher. I mean, we'll continue to talk to the FDA, express our concerns, look for clarification, continue to engage with Congress on possible alternatives, legislative alternatives to the final rule. However, it would be irresponsible for us to ignore it completely. And so we need to prepare our members. And we will continue to provide information to our members as it becomes available. We intend to provide guidance when we can. And most important, we need to make sure that our members are ready for the implementation.
Yeah, I would, underline that last statement. And, right at the end, I will be mentioning some of the things that are upcoming, and we are going to be providing a lot of resources for our members. Understanding that, maybe a legislative, something will come along legislatively, such as maybe the VALID Act or something very similar that might change a little bit of how we would prepare, but we're not letting time pass. We are working on those resources as we speak. Dr. Pritt, anything to add to that one? Okay.
No, you said it very well.
Okay, thank you. Charles, next question, please.
Yeah, so this is related, and so let's just say nothing changes in terms of new legislation. What will the CAP do to help ensure pathologists can comply with the least amount of burden?
Yeah, so that's exactly that point that we were just mentioning. We are going to be providing a large number of resources. We will be continuing to have webinars as an example, and for sure before each stage. But I'm expecting that we'll have other webinars as more information becomes available. We are going to be providing checklists, templates, the whole long list of of resources that we think will be helpful to members. We will be constantly publishing on our website any new information, any clarifications that come forward. So we're going to be working literally night and day to make sure that our members have what they need to comply as easily and as least expensively as possible. Dr. Saad, Dr. Pritt, you want to add anything to that?
That answers several questions that came up. I think you answered that well. There was a question about white papers that will be part of the guidance that we'll be providing.
Yes. Yeah, good point. We will, of course, have publications as well. Charles, next question.
Do you anticipate a failed proficiency testing would be considered an adverse event and would make failed PT require reporting to the CAP and the FDA?
So as we all know, PT failures currently get reported, and currently the CAP, if the failures fulfill certain criteria, those are reported. And yes, I think that would be regarded as a potential problem for an LDT. Now, would that mean that LDT now has to be reported as problematic to the FDA? That's going to probably require some questioning as to exactly what the reporting requirements would be under this final rule. And by the way, the FDA, as agencies always do, they're going to be adding much more detail to a lot of the provisions in this rule. Yes, it's 528 pages long, but there's lots of additional details that they're going to be publishing that, to instruct people how to comply with different things. So, the whole issue of PT failure, if it's repeated PT failures of a serious nature, as we currently do, sometimes those tests have to be taken down and remedial actions taken. That would certainly apply, I would think, to LDTs that are being regulated by the FDA. Okay, Charles, next question, please.
Okay, and I think this will probably be our last question for today. And this is with regards to risk classification. How can we determine them for NGS and FISH testing?
Yeah, so once again, we don't determine them. That's going to be the premise of the FDA. Some of those tests may currently be regarded as high risk, but we and others have advocated very strongly for certain companion diagnostics and certain other genomic and FISH-based tests. We've argued to the FDA that they should not be high risk because of mitigating factors that allow those tests to be done safely and accurately produced for patients. We're going to continue to argue those points. So I would not suggest that every NGS or FISH assay is going to automatically end up high risk. It may be currently regarded as high risk, but the FDA is going through this process of down risking a lot of tests. When they published that announcement, they even mentioned companion diagnostics as one of their targets, that they potentially could be down risking some companion diagnostics. Which some of the tests, I think, that, as was just described, would qualify as companion diagnostics. Dr. Pritt, Dr. Saad, any additional color on that one?
No, sir, nothing to add.
Okay. Well, Charles, I see that we have 2 minutes left. Maybe we can try one more question if we can answer it quickly.
Sure. Well, there's just a general question about modifications and how the rule treats modifications.
Yeah, so it was mentioned in the final rule that if the modification is minor, it may not qualify fully as an LDT. We need to clarify that as well when we sit and talk with FDA leaders. So I'm not sure we have we can outline exactly the criteria that would be used at this point in time. The final rule did have some verbiage on that, but that's going to be one that we will probably need some further clarification. So I do think we've come now to the end of the time that we have today. Thank you very much for your great questions. There were lots of questions we didn't get to. There's more than 100 questions that have been posted. We are going to make a monumental effort to get answers to you offline to the questions that you've posed as best as we can. And stay tuned, because we will be having, many more sessions similar to this, and other written resources that will be providing some more information. So as I mentioned earlier, the webinar recording and slides will be posted on cap.org. We will have many more webinars that will be similar to this, and attempting to answer questions and clarify points. We'll also have updates periodically in Advocacy Update, our weekly newsletter. And as we said earlier, there's going to be a long list of educational and other materials that will help our members and other pathologists and laboratorians help people to comply with these requirements. So let me just thank my two colleagues, Dr. Pritt and Dr. Saad, for your presentations. Also, Charles Fiegel and his team for helping prepare this webinar. And thank you very much for joining us. And we look forward to talking with you again soon. Have a good day.